Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasāmi. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and read the next section from Ajahn Jeff's Selves and Not-self, starting where we left off last night. First, I wasn't going to read this one, but then I reread it and decided I really need to read it. So, and then maybe do a few other readings from the canon as well afterwards. So if you remember, the talk that I read last night from this book was Not Self for Mundane Happiness, and this evening's reading is his talk again from that retreat in France in 2011 on Not Self, and this chapter or talk is Not Self for Transcendent Happiness. Last night we talked about the teaching on Not Self on the mundane level as it relates to the issue of rebirth and karma. On this level you apply the perception of Not Self in a selective way. You look at the skills you can take with you. You figure out what things would prevent you from taking good skills with you, and you try to perceive the second set of things as not self. In this way, you can develop the conditions for a good rebirth and the ability to deal with whatever you may encounter as you go through this cycle of death and rebirth. But as you contemplate the issue of rebirth, you begin to see that even if you develop good mental qualities, the whole process is still very risky and uncertain. When things get comfortable, it's very easy to get complacent and to forget to keep working at developing good qualities. And even the best life in the cosmos has to end in separation and death. You've experienced these sufferings countless times in the past, and if you don't gain release from the process of rebirth, you'll have to endure the same sufferings countless times in the future. When this realization goes deeply into the heart, you're ready for the transcendent teaching on Not Self. This is the topic for tonight's talk. The transcendent teaching on Not Self derives from transcendent right view, and transcendent right view comes in two stages. The first stage sees experience in terms of the Four Noble Truths of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the practice leading to its cessation. As you may remember, each of these truths carries a duty. If you want to put an end to suffering, suffering should be comprehended. Its cause should be abandoned, its cessation should be realized, and the path to its cessation should be developed as a skill. The purpose of the transcendent teaching on Not Self is to help you perform each of these duties. In the First Noble Truth, the Buddha identifies suffering with the 5 clinging aggregates. Notice that the aggregates themselves are not suffering. The mind suffers because it clings to them. As I've already mentioned, clinging is also similar to the process of feeding. We keep doing something again and again, that's the clinging, as a means of finding happiness, that's the feeding. A good example of this is an experiment some neurobiologists once did with mice. They located the pleasure center in each mouse's brain and planted a little electrode in there. When the mice pushed their heads against a little bar, the bar would give a mild electric stimulation to the pleasure center. They got so addicted to pressing their heads against the bar, doing it again and again and again, that they forgot to eat and they died. They were feeding on a pleasure that was very immediate and intense, but provided no nourishment. That's why they died. The same principle applies to the human mind. We usually feed on the aggregates in a way that provides no real nourishment, and so our goodness dies. On the transcendent level of right view, the Buddha has us use the perception of not-self as a means for comprehending this clinging and feeding to the point where we feel no more passion for it. But his approach is a little indirect. As we've already seen, instead of telling you to simply stop feeding on the aggregates, he has you turn them into a path, the health food that gives strength to the mind to the point where it no longer needs to feed. The primary example of this is the practice of right concentration. As we've already said, right concentration is composed of the 5 aggregates and the feelings of ease, rapture, and refreshment that come from right concentration are health food for the mind. You learn through this practice that you can find a sense of happiness that comes from within, and you no longer need to go looking for nourishment outside. To develop this sort of concentration, you have to apply the perception of not-self in a selective way. You hold on to your concentration and apply the perception of not-self to any distracting thoughts that would pull you away from the object of your concentration. As you gain skill and maturity in applying this perception in this way, it can enable you to let go of many attachments to other, lesser forms of happiness that you now realize you no longer need, in particular the pleasures of sensuality. When you realize you no longer need them, you find that there was nothing really there. One of my favorite cartoons shows a group of cows in a pasture. This must be Gary Larson. One of the cows is jerking its head up in a sudden state of surprise and realization, saying, "Hey, wait a minute. This is grass. We've been eating grass." The canon has a similar story. A blind man has been given an old dirty rag and told that it's a clean white cloth. He's very protective of his clean white cloth. But then his relatives take him to a doctor and the doctor cures his blindness. He looks at the cloth and realizes that he was fooled. It's just a dirty old rag. The Dhamma point in both the cartoon and in the story is that we often blindly look for pleasures in things that, when we come to our senses, we realize we're never all that satisfying to begin with. In some cases, the pleasure is actually unhealthy, causing you to do things that you later regret. And just as a reminder, he's going to be using the word jhana here several times, and just trying to program your mind to think of maybe not so much in the commentarial sense, but in the development of composure of mind, development of composure, collectedness of mind, samadhi. The practice of jhana provides the perspective that allows you to step back from your sensual passions and all your other unskillful ways of looking for pleasure to see that they weren't worth the effort put into gaining them. This forces you to step back from the unskillful committee members that push for those ways of looking for pleasure, and to ask whether you want to continue associating and identifying with them or not. This process isn't always easy. You tend to identify with those unskillful committee members because you associate them with pleasure. But the practice of jhana helps make this process of disidentification possible. When you can see that, in comparison to the blameless pleasure of jhana, these other committee members also bring you stress and pain, you can also more easily regard them as not self. You can let them go. As the practice of jhana matures, there eventually comes a point when you realize that only one attachment remains blocking unconditioned happiness, and that's attachment to the path itself. In particular, to the practice of concentration and the development of discernment. This is where the Buddha starts having you apply the transcendent teaching on not-self all around, and not just selectively. In other words, you apply the perception of not-self to every instance of clinging to the aggregates, even to the aggregates that go into jhana and discernment. This is how the not-self teaching helps you with the duties of comprehending stress and abandoning every form of craving, clinging, passion, or delight that would give rise to stress. The following passage shows the main stages in this process. First, you master the state of jhana. Then you try to develop perceptions that give rise to a sense of dispassion for the jhana. Once you've developed that sense of dispassion, you develop the perception in which you see all around dispassion and cessation as desirable. Then you learn how to drop even that perception and stay right there. That, the Buddha says, is where full awakening can occur. And here's the passage. Suppose that an archer or archer's apprentice were to practice on a straw man or mound of clay, so that after a while he would become able to shoot long distances, to fire accurate shots in rapid succession, and to pierce great masses. In the same way, there's the case where a monk enters and remains in the first jhana, rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. He regards whatever phenomena there are connected with form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness as inconstant, stressful, a disease, a cancer, an arrow, painful, an affliction, alien, a disintegration, an emptiness, not self. He turns his mind away from those phenomena, and having done so, inclines his mind to the property of deathlessness. This is peace. This is sublime. The stilling of all formations, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the ending of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. Staying right there, he reaches the ending of the fermentations. Or, if not, then, through this very Dhamma passion, this Dhamma delight, and from the total wasting away of the first 5 fetters, which are self-identity views, grasping at habits and practices, uncertainty, sensual passion, and irritation. He is due to be reborn in the pure abodes, there to be totally unbound, never again to return from that world. Similarly with the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th jhana. That's from Anguttara 9, the Anguttara 9's number 36. A couple of points in this passage need to be explained. First, when the Buddha talks about the ending of fermentation, which is Ajahn Jeff's translation for asava, often translated as outflows or sometimes influxes, but Ajahn Jeff uses fermentations. First, when the Buddha talks about the ending of fermentation, he's talking about awakening. The fermentations are the defilements that come bubbling up in the mind. Second, with regard to the 2nd stage, where the Buddha says to perceive the aggregates in the jhana as inconstant, stressful, etc. Excuse me. There are other passages in the canon that expand on this point. In these passages, the Buddha recommends that you apply 3 questions derived from the original question that he said was the basis of discernment. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? At this point in the practice, he recommends looking more closely at the idea of long-term happiness. Focus on the word long-term. You know that jhana is a long-term happiness, but now you realize that long-term is no longer good enough. It's inconstant. The Pali term here, anicca, is sometimes translated as impermanent, but that's not what it really means. Its opposite, nicca, describes something that's done constantly and reliably. You can depend on it. But if something is anicca, it's unreliable. It wavers. If you try to base your happiness on it, you have to keep tensing up around it, like trying to find some rest while sitting on a chair with wobbly, uneven legs. So when you see that even the long-term happiness of jhana is inconstant, unreliable, and wavering, you realize that it's not really all that pleasant. Even in what pleasure it does offer, there is stress. And because there's stress, Why would you want to claim it as yours? This line of thinking corresponds to the three questions that the Buddha has you ask at this stage in the practice. The first is this constant? And the answer is no. That leads to the next question. If it's inconstant, is it pleasant? Again, the answer is no. And that leads to the third question. If something is inconstant and stressful, is it fitting to say that this is me, this is myself, this is what I am? In other words, is it skillful to lay claim to this? And the answer again is no. Now, notice that the Buddha is not asking you to come to the conclusion that there is no self. He's simply asking you to see if this way of creating a sense of self is skillful. His method of analysis, when it's consistently applied to all of the aggregates, gives rise to a sense of disenchantment and dispassion for any possible type of clinging. But notice, you're not doing this out of pessimism. You're doing this for the sake of your own true happiness. But now it's better than longer than long-term. You want something totally timeless and reliable. As that passage just now indicated, sometimes this series of questions leads to full awakening, but sometimes it doesn't. It leads instead to the state of non-return. Now, the level of awakening at non-return is not bad. A group of people once came to see my teacher, Ajahn Karuṇadhammo. They had been studying Buddhist philosophy and had heard that he was a good teacher, but they didn't know what he taught. So they came and asked him to teach them. He said, "Okay, close your eyes and focus on your breath." And they said, No, we can't do that." He asked, "Why?" And they said, "If we focus on the breath, we'll get stuck on jhana, and then we'll be reborn as Brahmas." And Ajahn Karuṇadhammo responded, "What's wrong with being reborn as a Brahma? Even non-returners are born as Brahmas. And being reborn as a Brahma is better than being reborn as a dog." In other words, if you haven't attained jhana, it's hard to let go of sensual passions. And people stuck on sensual passions, even if they've studied Buddhist philosophy, can easily be reborn as dogs. So the dangers of jhana and non-return are much slighter than the dangers of not reaching those attainments. Still, if possible, the Buddha does encourage you to try to go beyond the level of non-return and gain full awakening. This is where he brings in another teaching, another perception. In Pali, the phrase is sabbe dhamma anattā, which means all phenomena are not self. This applies both to fabricated phenomena and unfabricated phenomena. And it's important to note here that this perception is part of the path, not the goal. In other words, it's not the conclusion you come to when you arrive at awakening. It's a perception you use to get beyond your last attachments. As the above passage states, what keeps a non-returner from gaining total awakening is a type of passion and delight. Passion for the deathless and delight in the deathless. Passion and delight is another term for clinging. Even when the mind lets go of its clinging and passion for the aggregates, there still is something it may cling to. The experience of the deathless that follows after letting go of the aggregates. The mind can regard its experience of the deathless as a phenomenon, as an object of the mind. Where there is an object, there is a subject. The knowing self, the sense of I am. And this provides a foothold for passion and delight to arise. You instinctively want to control whatever you like, and so you try to control the experience of the deathless, even though the idea of control here is superfluous. The deathless isn't going to change on you, and it's counterproductive. The self created around this desire for control actually gets in the way of total freedom. To counter this tendency toward control, the Buddha here has you apply the perception that all phenomena are not self, even to the experience of the deathless. This is what gets rid of the I in I am. There's another passage relevant to this point where the Buddha says that when you see all phenomena arising and passing away, and this includes everything, including the path and your clinging to the deathless, When you watch everything arising, arising, arising all the time, the idea of non-existence doesn't occur to the mind. When you see these things passing away, passing away, passing away, the idea of existence doesn't occur to the mind. At that point, the ideas of existence and non-existence are irrelevant to your experience. All you see is stress arising and stress passing away. And that's the Kaccana-gotta Sutta in the Connected Discourses of the Buddha, 12:15, I think. This has several ramifications. If ideas of existence and non-existence don't occur to you, then the question of whether the self exists or doesn't exist wouldn't occur to you either. This gets rid of the am in I am. This also does away with your fear of going out of existence if things are let go, because the mind isn't thinking in those terms. At the same time, you're reaching the higher stage of transcendent right view, with a higher and more refined level of duty. As you remember with the Four Noble Truths, each of the truths has a duty, but in this case, when you see everything arising and passing away simply as stress, all the duties are reduced to one. You comprehend things to the point of dispassion. This means that you let go even of concentration, even of discernment, even of the act of clinging to the deathless. In the words of Ajahn Mun, all Four Noble Truths are turned into one. They all carry the same duty, which is to let go of everything. This allows the mind to experience nibbana not as a phenomenon, but as a total experience. At this point, you've found total happiness, which no longer needs any protection, no longer needs to be maintained. There's no longer any issue of control or non-control. There's no need for the strategy of self to create this happiness, and no need for a sense of self to consume or experience it. Where you don't draw a line to define self, there's no line to define not-self. Where there's no clinging, there's no need for the strategy of not-self. So strategies of self or not-self are all put aside. Even the strategy of dispassion itself gets put aside. At this point, the mind no longer has need for any strategies at all, because it has found a happiness that's truly solid. It's not a phenomenon, it's a happiness. The Buddha refers to it as a special form of consciousness that doesn't need to be experienced through the six senses, or what he calls the all. It's directly experienced as total freedom. And at that moment of awakening, there's no experience of the six senses. However, after the moment of awakening, when the mind returns to the experience of the senses, this sense of freedom stays. The canon illustrates this with an image. Not a pretty image, but very memorable. The image is this. Suppose there's a dead cow. You take a knife and remove the skin, cutting all of the tendons and tissues that connect the skin to the cow. Then you put the skin back on. The question is the skin still attached to the cow as it was before? And the answer is no. Even though it's right next to the cow, it's no longer attached. In the same way, the practice of discernment is like a knife. It cuts through all of the attachments between the senses and their objects. Once the attachments are gone, then even if you put this knife away, you cannot connect things in the way they were before. The eye still sees forms, the ear hears sounds, but there's a sense that these things are no longer joined. As I said, the image isn't pretty, but it conveys the point that once total freedom is found, it's never lost. One final point. As we said in one of the earlier talks, you are limited by what you are obsessed with. You define yourself by your obsessions and attachments. And that sort of definition places limitations on you. When there are no longer any attachments or obsessions, you are no longer defined. And because you are no longer defined, You can't be described as existing, not existing, neither or both. In other words, ideas of the existence of the self and the non-existence of the self no longer apply. As for perceptions of self and not self, those are like the knife that has been used to cut things through, but now has been put aside. Okay, now I'm going to read a few passages from the canon. And this first one is a classic that many people are familiar with. And it's from the Khanda Samyutta, section 22. And it's sutta number 95 in the Khanda Samyutta, a lump of foam. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Ayodhya on the bank of the river Ganges. There the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, suppose that this river Ganges was carrying along a great lump of foam. A man with good sight would inspect it, ponder it, and carefully investigate it. And it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in a lump of foam? So too bhikkhus, whatever kind of form there is, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. If a bhikkhu inspects it, ponders it, and carefully investigates it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in form? Suppose, bhikkhus, that in the autumn, when it is raining and big drops are falling, a water bubble arises and bursts on the surface of the water. A man with good sight would inspect it, ponder it, and carefully investigate it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in a water bubble? So too, bhikkhus, whatever kind of feeling there is, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. A bhikkhu inspects it, ponders it, and carefully investigates it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in feeling? Suppose, bhikkhus, that in the last month of the hot season, at high noon, a shimmering mirage appears. A man with good sight would inspect it, ponder it, and carefully investigate it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in a mirage? So too, bhikkhus, whatever kind of perception there is, whether past, future, present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. A bhikkhu inspects it, ponders it, and carefully investigates it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in perception? Suppose, bhikkhus, that a man needing heartwood, seeking heartwood, wandering in search of heartwood, would take a sharp axe and enter a forest. There he would see the trunk of a large plantain tree, straight, fresh, without a fruit bud core. He would cut it down at the root, cut off the crown, and unroll the coil. As he unrolls the coil, he would not find even softwood, let alone hardwood. A man with good sight would inspect it, ponder it, and carefully investigate it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in the trunk of a plantain tree? So too, bhikkhus, whatever kind of volitional formations there are, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. A bhikkhu inspects them, ponders them, and carefully investigates them. And as he investigates them, they appear to him to be void, hollow, and insubstantial. For what substance could there be in volitional formations? Suppose, bhikkhus, that a magician or a magician's apprentice would display a magical illusion at a crossroads. A man with good sight would inspect it, ponder it, and carefully investigate it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in a magical illusion? So too, bhikkhus, whatever consciousness there is, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, a bhikkhu inspects it, ponders it, and carefully investigates it, and it would appear to him to be void, hollow, insubstantial. For what substance could there be in consciousness? Seeing thus, bhikkhus, the instructed noble disciple experiences disenchantment towards form, disenchantment towards feeling, disenchantment towards perception, disenchantment towards volitional formations, disenchantment towards consciousness. Experiencing disenchantment, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, his mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge. It is liberated. He understands, destroyed is birth, the holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more for this state of being. This is what the Blessed One said. Having said this, the Fortunate One, the teacher, further said this. Form is like a lump of foam, feeling like a water bubble. Perception is like a mirage. Volitions like a plantain trunk, and consciousness like an illusion. So explained the kinsman of the sun. However one may ponder it and carefully investigate it, it appears but hollow and void when one views it carefully. With reference to this body, the one of broad wisdom has taught that with the abandoning of three things, one sees this form discarded. When vitality, heat, and consciousness depart from this physical body, then it lies there, cast away, food for others, without volition. Such is this continuum, this illusion, beguiler of fools. It is taught to be a murderer. Here, no substance can be found. A bhikkhu with energy aroused should look upon the aggregates thus, whether by day or at night, comprehending, ever mindful. He should discard all the fetters and make a refuge for himself. Let him fare as with head ablaze, yearning for the imperishable state. Now a few verses from the Theragāthā, the poems of the enlightened elders. This is number 118, Kimbila. As if sent by a curse, it drops on us, aging. The body seems other, though it's still the same one. I'm still here and have never been absent from it, but I remember myself as if somebody else's. Number 226, Punamasa. Shedding 5 hindrances so as to reach the unexcelled rest from the yoke. Taking the Dhamma as mirror for knowing and seeing myself. I reflected on this body, the whole thing, inside and out, my own and others. How vain and empty the body appeared. Number 16, number 1, Adimutta and the bandits. The bandit chief. Those who for the sake of sacrifice, for the sake of wealth, we have killed in the past, against their will, have trembled and babbled from fear. But you show no fear. Your complexion brightens. Why don't you lament in the face of what's greatly to be feared? Venerable Adimutta. There are no painful mind states, chieftain, in one without longing. In one whose fetters are ended, all fears are overcome. With the ending of craving, the guide to becoming, When phenomena are seen for what they are, then, as in the laying down of a burden, there's no fear in death. I've lived well the holy life, well developed the path. Death holds no fear for me. It's like the end of a disease. I've lived well the holy life, well developed the path, seen states of becoming as devoid of allure, like poison spit out after it's drunk. One gone to the far shore without clinging, effluent free, his task completed, welcomes the ending of life, as if freed from a place of execution. Having attained the supreme rightness, unconcerned with all the world, as if released from a burning house, he doesn't sorrow at death. Whatever's compounded, wherever a state of becoming's obtained, all that has no one in charge, so says the great seer. Whoever discerns this, is taught by the awakened one, would no more grasp hold of any state of becoming than he would a hot iron ball. I have no I was, no I will be. Fabrications will simply go out of existence. What's to lament there in that? For one who sees as it actually is, the pure arising of phenomena, the pure seriality of fabrications, there's no fear. When seeing the world with discernment, as on a par with grass and twigs, finding no mineness, thinking there's nothing of mine, he feels no sorrow. Dissatisfied with this carcass, I'm unconcerned with becoming. This body will break up, and there will not be another. Do as you like with this carcass. From that I will feel neither hatred nor love. Hearing these awesome, hair-raising words, the young men threw down their weapons and said, "What have you done, sir, or who have you taken as mentor? Because of whose teachings is this lack of sorrow acquired?" Venerable Atimutta, the all-knowing, all-seeing conqueror, he is my mentor, greatly compassionate teacher, all the world's healer. This doctrine is his, unexcelled, leading to ending. Because of his teachings is this lack of sorrow acquired. The bandits, hearing the good words of the seer, threw down their swords and their weapons. Some relinquished their life of crime, some chose the going forth. Having gone forth in the teachings of the one well gone, developing the strengths and factors for awakening, wise, happy, exultant in mind, their faculties ripened. They touched uncompounded unbinding. Okay, I'll leave it there for tonight's readings. And see if there's any questions or comments, thoughts that people might have.
I have a question about what you mentioned. You made a little disclaimer about jhana, commentarial interpretation of jhana, and I guess you might be referring to like access and absorption aspects of jhana. I'm just wondering if there's some other kind of way to approach it, like do these factors of jhana that I mentioned in the sutras arise in some other way that's not absorption that we should be aiming for? Or is there something wrong with trying to aim for absorption? Or like, I'm just kind of not sure what exactly.
What to do with all that. Yeah, I think that's a discussion that could probably go for a few months. We actually did spend a couple of weeks with it last winter retreat, exploring what the differences between the commentarial descriptions of jhana and the sutta descriptions of jhana were. And it kind of gets into a lot of notions and ideas. And this really isn't quite the time to do that, but it was like Daniel was asking about that the other night too, and I gave him that reference that I could also pass that on to you as for further exploring kind of how the commentaries and the suttas describe and use the word jhana to describe different approaches to, like the object of concentration and the experience itself of what each of them calls jhana, but does feel quite different in many ways. I mean, the real short description would be the general delineation of jhana in the commentaries as they do use the word, the three kinds of jhana: momentary, neighborhood or access, and absorption, and describe generally a path to these, what their description of, all the way through to absorption as being the result of a very singular, fixed, narrow focus on an object to the exclusion of other experience. That's, and how they use the word single-pointed or like ekaggata as that kind of like narrowing the field of attention into a very small single point on an object, usually the breath, at a specific point in the body, and that the results of that are what the commentaries refer to as jhana, absorption in the various stages, with the same descriptions that are in the suttas. Whereas in the suttas, and particularly I think many of our teachers describe something that's not as singular, such as so small a focus, a narrow focus, that it's a broader development of a composed, collected state of mind that is still has a very strong quality of all-around awareness, emphasizing the clear comprehension of what you might call a bigger one point, a broader focus, and that the experience that comes from that is different in many ways, and is a much easier to maintain a sense of clarity and discernment within that broader kind of focus than it is within a very focused, singular pointed kind of a thing. So that's sort of my kind of description in a nutshell, which is probably somewhat limited because of the time, but I'm not sure if Lumpur would add anything to that.
Probably the only thing I would add is also the commentarial tends to be kind of exclusively about a mind state, and the sutta presentation tends to be more of an integrated body-mind experience, and that's actually a big difference. I feel anyway. So that's an aspect of to be reflecting or considering.
It's kind of interesting, just that point, I think was being pointed to in that one passage that I read. If I can find it. Where the Buddha's talking about there's a case where the monk enters and remains in the first jhana, and then he regards whatever phenomena there are connected with form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness as inconstant, stressful, disease, etc. And all through all four jhanas, the same formula. And that really implies that you're fully experiencing the five khandhas in some way or another. You know, you're not just totally, avoiding, obliterating from your awareness the experience of the body and the mind.
I'm curious to know if the different realms of existence and the different types of beings that the Buddha describes are conditioned, and if those realms might not exist in the same way that the Buddha described, at some point in the future or at some point in the past, they might exist in different ways, or if this is more of like an unconditioned description of the nature of reality.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There is no unconditioned description of the nature of reality. I'm not sure what you mean by that. But in terms of the first part of your question, whether the different realms, might exist in different ways in the future, I think that's what you were saying. Whether they would possibly be different. Your guess is as good as mine in some ways. Those realms where those beings live, various spheres of rebirth, are dependent on certain qualities that beings develop and in their conditioning. Oftentimes in the higher realms, most of them are, probably all of them are based on at least a very strong basis of virtuous conduct, and other very skillful, wonderful qualities like generosity and loving kindness and various of those kinds of skillful mental qualities. And the realm itself, the characteristics of the realm, of a particular realm, is dependent on kind of a combination of those, a specific combination of all of those qualities that result in the birth in that realm. So as much as a realm is dependent on certain qualities that a person develops and absorbs into in their in a particular lifetime and then gets reborn, it would seem like to some extent those qualities would remain the same in that realm, because that's what the realm depends on. So that would be my sort of guess, and I've never seen anything like that particularly discussed in the suttas, so this is just kind of my interpretation of where those realms come from. If you're interested, in that to a greater extent, Ajahn Karuṇadhammo, the Cosmos, you've seen that book? Yeah, okay. I would say that should be your go-to reference for any questions along those lines.
I'm wondering about this forward perception. I'm wondering if, say, in practice of contemplation of elements, say, becoming more sensitive to solidity or liquid in the body, is that the same as developing perception of earth or water? Or are those slightly different ways of approaching the contemplation of the elements?
Well, go ahead.
Well, in order to contemplate something, you have to develop a perception. That's the way the mind works. So you can't separate. There is no such thing as a pure thought or even a pure concept. There for what one thinks, one feels, what one feels, one perceives. Those are these khandhas are conjoined. They are not disjoined. It's just that they're part of the process. So that perception is definitely a one can lead with a perception, or one can lead with a thought, but they're still going to be working together. And it's just that what are you leading with, but they're going to be there together.
I have a question also about elements practice in, I think it's in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, there's a simile, and I was kind of curious about it. It's like, I think it's the way the Buddha talks about how a monk would, how somebody would practice elements as body contemplation, and the simile is of a butcher
or a butcher's apprentice
carving up a cow sitting at the crossroads.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really say all that much more than that, but I was just curious how you understand that.
I think one of the things is just that element, or that directing of attention to the parsing out our experience, and like just parsing out our experience and getting a feel, or a perception, an idea of there's these different elements of our body, and the aspect of solidity is experienced differently than the element of fluidity or cohesion, or air or heat, so that it's just sort of an act of parsing out in order to kind of experience, because our habit, or our predominant way of experiencing things is, somewhat superficial, or seeing things on the surface, or what presents itself immediately, and has a certain cohesive aspect to it. So that and much of contemplation or investigation is trying to parse things out a bit, so that we're starting to see the conditioned nature, or the interdependent nature of experience and phenomena, mental and physical, and so that the element contemplation is a good way of highlighting that kind of reality of how think, okay, there's more going on here than just me and my body, and certainly me and my mind. That makes sense?
And maybe also just another framework for looking at the three characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta.
Yeah.
Just seeing the insubstantiality, or of a being in relation to any of the four elements.
Yeah.